Hey, good morning, fellow lovers of the Word and counselors. This is Dr. Tom, and I've been wanting to do this for a while, but health hasn't allowed me. I want to speak on how to read the eyes of an individual. In counseling, I will use many different techniques to discern what is the root cause of the issue that the person is experiencing or what it is, especially when dealing with any of the four personality types. Personality disorders, sociopathologies, psychopathologies, dealing narcissistic personality disorders, any of the four types, to include borderline personality disorders. Any of the personality disorders can be seen in this. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you: is the physiological changes that occur within the brain happen simultaneously, and they happen instantaneously. The brain is very quick. It's a supercomputer, and so the way that it works is very fast. Now, in neurolinguistics and kinetics with neurolinguistics, what we learn is every word is attached to a specific type of emotion, or it is detached. Okay? This is what's called occurrence, relative occurrence. And what happens is within relative occurrence, and the reason why it's called relative occurrence is, say for instance, you have a person who sees a snake and, they have not only empathy but love for snakes. So just hearing the word snake, it'll bring up that thought of love and of empathy. So how will it affect the eyes? Well, you're going to notice that the eyes are affected by everything attached to emotions in neurolinguistics, because it causes a physiological or biological change, phenological change within the brain. Now, you can see that in the eyes. The detachment you will see in the facial structure. For instance, you notice my forehead wrinkles. This type of wrinkling going from left to right shows that both sides of my brain are working together simultaneously. Now, if it was only wrinkling on, let's say, the right side, that would tell you that the left side of my brain was the only part that was concerned. So that would tell you that I am bicameral. I'm not bicameral, of course, because both sides are working together. But if that's called unicameralism, or what we'd call unification, or solid crossover. So that means both sides of my brain are working. But if only one side of my brain was working, you would see the effect on one side. Now, that's in detachment disorders. Detachment disorders, you have to watch the way that the face works. But if it's not a detachment disorder, you can see the effects within the eyes. So, for instance, you'll say, who do you love more, your mother or your father? You wait to see what the eyes look like. If there's no change, then there's no trigger there. There's nothing tied to the root cause. So when you ask someone a question like, what was your first car? Well, you'd say that's a very innocent question. Well, maybe they had a severe car wreck with their first car. You don't know. And that could be the source of the trauma. I've had that happen. Where I asked a young lady, well, I call her young, she was in her 30s, I was given the barrage method, and that's where I ask a series of questions. I don't give them time to think. You can't give them time to think because you want the autonomic response, the automatic response to occur within the brain. You don't want them to think about it and logically discern. So what you're doing by giving them a barrage method is you're not allowing the first, second, or the third layer, the presenting conscience, subconscious, or anterior aspect of the subconscious, you're not allowing them to interfere in the questioning. So that automatically takes you to the fourth layer of the brain and below. Fourth layer, of course, being the value and belief systems that separate the fight or flight, survival, and coping mechanisms of the fifth layer from the frontal lobes. So in other words, we're getting down into the motor of the vehicle and how it runs. So if you ask somebody, in an innocent question, what was your first car? And you see one eye shrink down into a pupil, the pupil shrink, dilate in one eye, or expand in the other, the one that it expands in, you will know, is a fear mechanism, a trauma mechanism. If it pinpricks, it tells you it's a fight mechanism. And you say, well, why would one eye get big and one eye get small? Well, I'm using this as an example because it's a real one. And the reality is they disassociated and separated that trauma from themselves because it was too TOO. It was too powerful for them to deal with. And so what happened is the trauma was stored on one side of the brain, where the personality was created that had went through the trauma and the pain and the suffering. On the opposite side of the brain, where you see the pinprick or the fight mechanism, it tells you that that side of the brain is hooked to the rear hemisphere, whereas this side of the brain is actually hooked to an emotional center. So that's split brain, bicamerality. So what does this tell me? It tells me I have to deal with a personality that's been traumatized and put through a near-death experience. When somebody's been traumatized and put through a near-death experience, they most likely will have demonization or a demonic attachment. Anytime somebody goes to die and there's extreme terror or trauma or fear, you can count on it. There's going to be a demon that is trying to work in there and affect it. Because God doesn't give us the spirit of fear. He gives us one of, sobriety, peace, authority, and supernatural power to overcome it. But a demon will bring fear with him. He'll bring terror. He'll bring darkness, hope, lessness. Okay? Now, the eyes will tell you everything. So in this case, it tells me that they had to fight in order to survive. That's why the pinprick. And the brain, in order to survive, separated the trauma and put it into the one side of the brain. So when you go to work with a person, if you find a root cause, and it's split brain like that, fight on one side, flight on the other, or terror, you're going to find that you're going to have to cross over from one side of the brain to the other. You can do this by going over the top, around the back, or underneath. As interesting as that sounds. So let's talk about the eyes just a little bit. Let's say you have a client that comes to you and they have enlarged pupils and it's normal light in the room. So you begin asking them questions, and if the pupils are always transfixed or engorged, huge, and they don't change, that will tell you the person has been through an incredible amount of pain and that pain has lasted. In other words, torture. I'm going to go all the way back to 1989 for 1997, 99, right in there. When I was working on my master's, and I was at the Gothard Institute in Indiana, with the International Center of Biblical Counselors, and their School of Biblical Counselors was also located there. When I got there, I bring my suitcase in with me, check in. I go to get on the elevator, and two ladies get in, and they pin themselves to the one side. I'm wearing a suit. I'm very professional. And I look over. I said, "Hi, I'm Dr. Tom. I'm Tom Knotts. It's good to meet you." And the one lady responded and said, "I'm so-and-so, and this is my sister so-and-so." Well, their pupils were massive. I mean, they were almost like the size of the end of my pinky. But I noticed the light was more than substantial in the elevator and when we got off. And then later on, a couple days later, I met their counselor. And, me and him became very good friends, but their eyes had not changed. And we were standing in a well-lit, because sunlight was coming in all through this area where we met. And I don't know what you call it, a place where they'd have the buffet and stuff. And their eyes were gorged, hadn't changed. And so I asked him when we got private, I asked him because we became good friends. I said, "Have you noticed the gorged eyes of your two clients?" He says yes. He says it's lucky they're alive, that they were found and they had been chained, and they were used as sexual slaves. And they did not get rescued until they were like 14 and 16. They were 2 years apart. So they had endured a lifetime of being in slavery and being used to where they had no hope. But the thing is the type of bondage that they were used for was extreme sadomasochism. And so they would be put into situations where they were tortured, and the pain didn't stop for days and days and days. And so their eyes became fixed like that. And that's what happens. The brain goes and lives in the back. And because it's now living in the back, because it does not want to face the front. And when a brain goes to live in the back, it detaches from everything around it. And by detaching from everything around it, it does not allow them to feel the emotions anymore. They become cold, they become dead, they become lifeless. But thanks be to God, He's placed within all of us a desire for hope. That hope cannot be taken away, it's in the heart. Now they try to take hope away. People that are traffickers and sexual abusers, traffickers especially and programmers, will tell the person there's no hope. Give up on hope and just give in. And they do this to the tiniest of children, to the oldest of adults. So when you see those long, egated or engorged eyes, it tells you they've been through a lot of torment and pain, and it went on for a long time. Okay? Now let's say you go to pray and the person's eyes pinprick. Their pupils dilate and shrink down, and what does that tell you? That tells you they're getting ready to attack you or something else. I was working with a guy who was out of a biker group. I did not know he was an active biker, and he was a rough one, I guess. Him and his wife, who had led to salvation, she was a biker, and she brought him to me for counseling. Well, when I went and I asked him for authority to pray for him, and I did, and I always pray with my eyes open. And when I started praying, both of their eyes clicked open, hers and his. And they pinpricked, and they became possessed. And they come up out of their chairs, and I started praying, Father, would you please hold them? Don't let them get to me. Strike them down. And so God bound them, and I was able to take the demons out. But what I didn't know is they had done rituals that included things that are against the law, extremely against the law, and included blood and other things, and given themselves over. So I worked with them. I had to bind them both. I worked with her for several months after that, and I worked with him for 5 hours that day, and he wouldn't come back. And so I went to visit him after a week or so, and he's out in his pole barn, and he was working on a vehicle, a motorcycle, and so I went out, and he looks at me, and the next thing I know, he's possessed, and he pulls his belt off and his knife and throws it on the ground and says, let's finish this. I said, I don't want to fight you. I didn't come out here to fight you. And then I realized, I looked at his eyes, he was possessed again, and I bound him. The man started shaking like he was having a seizure. Now, this man was 6'7". He had a chain hanging around his waist that probably weighed 5 pounds. And he was a big man, and not fat either. He was like probably 270 pounds, mostly muscle. Started binding, and the thing's name was Corn and Zinch. And I didn't even know that those were names of devils in the Bible. But they had used biblical names and wed him to 5 different ones. Well, I had taken a couple out. I didn't know there was more. And so I worked with him until about midnight that night. Got the rest of the demons out of him. And it was because he didn't want to confess the reason why they were in there. Well, I was glad I did, because he didn't live long after that. But he died clean. So here's the thing. The eyes will always tell you if a person is severely traumatized. It'll tell you if they're bicameral or if they have 2 sides of the brain working autonomously. It will tell you if they're unicameral with the facial structure, if they're detached with the facial structure. When an eye pinpricks, it's the fight. Everybody knows that. When the pupil gorges, it's terror trauma. But now here is another thing you need to look at. The iris that surrounds the pupil. There will be a ring of black that'll go around it. Now, if you see a black ring come around the iris, that tells you that you have a split personality, a depersonalization disorder, a dissociative identity disorder, and a detachment disorder. You have pretty much most of the personality disorders if you see that ring get inflated around the iris. Why? That tells you that both the frontal lobes are now active and the rear hemisphere. So you've got two persons, one in the background listening and watching, and one in the front. Excuse me, let me get that phone. Sorry about that. So it tells you you've got two personalities present at the same time. Now this is very important. So that way you'll know when you're talking with the one in the front that you're actually talking to the one in the back too. Okay? So everything the one in the front is hearing, the one in the back is also hearing. And that's the one you want to address mostly. Alright, sorry about that again. I shut my phone off this time. So what do you do? Now here's the deal. When you're dealing with the ones in the dark that don't like to come forward, it's mostly because they're demonized and occultic. They hate themselves. They hate everybody. When you're working with somebody that comes out of a cult background or an abusive background, like a tribe where they circumcise the females, or Islamic, in Islam, most people don't like to admit it, but in Islam they'll have sodomy with their daughters because they believe by doing that they're still virgins in the front. So customs and things around the world, they don't realize that a child's brain isn't wired. Even when they feel like they're making love with the child and the child is orgasming and enjoying it, the child's brain cannot endure. Prior to the age of 9, it's not designed for the orgasm because it causes a major disruption. I mean, the positive centers will blow off. Literally, the whole head will come off. If you've ever looked at dendritic function and the reward centers and how they will shoot the rewards across, it'll blow the whole head off of that. I always think of them as like a dandelion, and they shoot a few of the things off, and that's how pleasure is, received over here, shot from over here. But what it does is it blows the entire head off, and that'll cause the brain to disrupt and disassociate, and so you'll create a sexually addicted part that will do whatever it wants and think there's nothing wrong, but the brain can't handle it, so it splits and puts that pleasure center, pleasure reward, and new personality to one side. So when you're going to be working with the severely, shall we say, handicapped, it's good to learn how to read facial expressions, how to read triggering, and then how to read cueing. Triggering is a response that wasn't supposed to come out. And so it's like a gun that goes off accidentally. But cueing is when somebody's been conditioned, and it happens naturally. Whether you're a male or a female, if, say, for instance, you've been conditioned to be a sexual slave, because there are quite a few males, actually maybe even more. In government, you tend to find mostly homosexuals. So when somebody's been raised in that, they will be conditioned to automatically just switch. Now here's another thing I want to touch upon. When somebody has been living with personalities their whole life from their youth, they won't know when they're switching. But as a counselor or a Christian counselor working with them, you have to be able to tell. Now how can you tell? When somebody switches, their body posture will switch. Their facial expression will switch. They'll get serious. Now they'll keep maintaining the same conversation because these personalities are used to just going in and out and keeping the same train of thought. They're just addressing it from a different paradigm because they all have their own personal views and opinions. And so when you see them switch, you'll notice different facial structure. They'll go from, like that. They'll keep talking, but this guy will be really serious, and the other one will be bon jovial, or happy and such. You'll see their body expression. They may stop breathing and go, that means they've just switched. Okay? Or their hand movements. For men, they'll do this with their hands like 2 or 3 times. I've seen that. And that's because when they train them, they'll smack the back of the hand, smack the front of the hand, smack the back of the hand, smack the front of the hand. They'll do it 3 times. And it seals it in because the person knows after their hands have been smacked, that they're no longer needed. The other personality, the pain is over, so now they can be the other person. Okay? I'm hoping this makes sense to you, because reading the eyes and the face is going to be your greatest tool in understanding how to find root causes and problems with individuals. All right, this is Dr. Tom. I pray this helps you. Lord bless you in Christ Jesus' name.